now.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yes, we have got it. Thank you very much. Oh, that was. Thanks for everyone who stood in, stepped in to save the situation. And thank you especially to Maggie, who for all your patience anyway. So huge welcome. I can promise you that if this was happening in person in Sheffield, we are a lot more organized than this as the Sheffield lot, and it wouldn't be happening in person. But anyway, it's still a huge a privilege and honor to have you, and even via such problematic technical circumstances, but really, really lovely to have you, Maggie. And so just for the audience who's also warmly welcome, just to tell you very quickly that there is going to be a short introduction. Maggie is going to read from, most likely from Bluets and the Argonauts. And there will be a brief Q&A if we've got the time and if Maggie is happy with that. I will kick off with a couple of questions, and if we have the time from the floor, from you guys, we will welcome questions in the chat, possibly. If you could put those down, and Adam will conduct the questions from the floor section. So without further ado or wasting of any precious moments, really, I'm going to introduce Maggie Nelson to you all. Not that she needs introduction. This is the second autumn event of the 22 autumn series of the Center for Poetry and Poetics, and our major and only reader tonight is Maggie Nelson, who is the author of several acclaimed books of poetry and prose, most recently the national bestseller on freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, a 2021 publication which was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and the best book of 2021 by the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and NPR. Maggie Nelson's other titles include the New York Times bestseller and National Book Critics Circle Award winner, The Argonauts. This was a 2015 publication. The Art of Cruelty, A Reckoning, a 2011 publication. This book was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and also Bluets, a 2009 publication, which was named by Bookforum as one of the top 10 best books of the past 20 years. The Red Parts, Autobiography of a Trio, published in 2007, and Women, the New York School and Other True Abstractions, also published in 2007. Other publications include poetry titles such as Something Bright Than Hose, 2007 collection, and Jane, a Murder, which was a collection of poems published in 2005. A book of her essays about art will be published in 2024. Maggie Nelson has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an NEA grant, an Innovative Literature Fellowship from Creative Capital, an Arts Writers Fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation, and the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. She currently teaches at the University of Southern California and lives in Los Angeles. So once again, very warm welcome to Maggie Nelson.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I know that it was hard to get here. Oh no, and now to celebrate our being here, my dog is gonna bark, and she gets to stay until she misbehaves, but then I might have to put her out. You know the deal. Well, I would love to meet, my hosts for longer, and I would love to meet all of you black boxes, whose your names are shining in your boxes. So maybe I'll get to meet you later. And I guess for now I'm supposed to read, so I'll read you a little bit with my shiny Zoom reflective glasses on. And yeah, I had been told that some of you had read the Argonauts and maybe Bluets, so it might be fun to hear things that you've already read. Neither of these are new books for me. Bluets was published in 2009, and the Argonauts came out incredibly, I think 7 years ago, but both of these books have had kind of new journeys overseas in the years since they came out, so they feel quite alive for me. So I'll read a little bit from the Argonauts to start, and I'll read the unit of this book is more or less the anecdote. And so I'll read kind of two anecdotes that have come up a lot when people are talking about this book. So not long ago, a friend came over to our house and pulled down a mug for coffee, a mug that was a gift from my mother. It's one of those mugs you can purchase online from Snapfish with the photo of your choice emblazoned on it. I was horrified when I received it, but it's the biggest mug we own, so we keep it around in case someone's in the mood for a trough of warm milk or something. Wow, my friend said, filling it up. I've never seen anything so heteronormative in all my life. The photo on the mug depicts my family and me dressed up to go to the Nutcracker at Christmas time, a ritual that was important to my mother when I was little, and that we have revived with her now that there are children in my life. In the photo, I'm 7 months pregnant with what will become my son, wearing a high ponytail and leopard print dress. Harry and his son are wearing matching dark suits, looking dashing. We're standing in front of the mantle at my mother's house, which has monogrammed stockings hanging from it. We look happy. But what about it is the essence of heteronormativity? That my mother made a mug on a bougie service like Snapfish? That we're clearly participating or acquiescing into participating in a long tradition of families being photographed at holiday time in their holiday best? That my mother made me the mug in part to indicate that she recognizes and accepts my tribe as family? What about my pregnancy? Is that inherently heteronormative? Or is the presumed opposition of queerness and procreation, or to put a finer edge on it, maternity, more of a reactionary embrace of how things have shaken down for queers, rather than the mark of some ontological truth? As more queers have kids, will the presumed opposition simply wither away? Will you miss it? Is there something inherently queer about pregnancy itself, insofar as it profoundly alters one's normal state and occasions a radical intimacy with and radical alienation from one's body? How can an experience so profoundly strange and wild and transformative also symbolize or enact the ultimate conformity? Or is this just another disqualification of anything tied too closely to the female animal from the privileged term, in this case, nonconformity, radicality? What about the fact that Harry's neither male nor female? I'm a special, a 2-for-1, his character Valentine explains in his Butch Buddy movie By Hook or By Crook. When or how do, and this is like a quote, but it's hard to mimic the grayscale quoting of my book, but so I'll just say who's speaking. When or how do, as Judith Butler says, new kinship systems mime older nuclear family arrangements? And when or how do they, quote, radically recontextualize them in a way that constitutes a rethinking of kinship, end quote? How can you tell, or rather, who is to tell? Tell your girlfriend to find a different kid to play house with, your ex would say after we first moved in. To align oneself with the real while intimating that others are at play, approximate, or an imitation of the real can feel good. But any fixed claim on realness, especially when it is tied to an identity, also has a finger in psychosis. As Lacan put it, if a man who thinks he is a king is mad, a king who thinks he is a king is no less so. Perhaps this is why psychologist Winnicott's notion of feeling real is so moving to me. One can aspire to feel real. One can help others to feel real. One can oneself feel real. A feeling Winnicott describes as the collected primary sensation of aliveness. Quote, the aliveness of the body tissues and working of body functions, including the heart's action and breathing, end quote, all of which makes spontaneous gesture possible. For Winnicott, feeling real is not reactive to external stimuli, nor is it an identity. It is a sensation that spreads. Among other things, it makes one want to live. Some people find pleasure in aligning themselves with an identity, as in, you make me feel like a natural woman, made famous by Aretha Franklin and then later by Judith Butler, who focused on the instability wrought by the simile, as in, you make me feel like a natural woman. But there can also be horror in doing so, not to mention an impossibility. As Denise Riley has it, it's not possible to live 24 hours a day soaked in the immediate awareness of one's sex. Gendered self-consciousness has, mercifully, Riley says, a flickering nature. A friend says he thinks of gender as a color. Gender does share with color a certain ontological indeterminacy. It isn't quite right to say an object is a color, nor that an object has a color. Context also changes it. All cats are gray, etc. Nor is color voluntary precisely. But none of these formulations means that the object in question is colorless. Butler says, the bad reading of gender trouble goes something like this. I can get up in the morning, look in my closet, and decide which gender I want to be today. I can take out a piece of clothing and change my gender, stylize it. Then that evening I can change it again and become something radically other. So what you get is something like the commodification of gender. When my whole point was that the very formation of subjects, the very formation of persons presupposes gender in a certain way. The gender is not to be chosen, and performativity is not radical choice, and it's not voluntarism. Performativity has to do with repetition, very often with the repetition of oppressive and painful gender norms to force them to re-signify. This is not freedom, but a question of how to work the trap one is inevitably in. That's the end of that quote. You should order a mug in response, my friend mused while drinking her coffee. Like, how about a mug that features Iggy's head crowning in all its bloody glory? I had told her earlier that day that I was vaguely hurt that my mother had not wanted to look at my birth photos. Harry then reminded me that few people ever want to look at anyone else's birth photos, at least not the graphic ones. And here I was forced to admit that my past feelings about other people's birth photos bore out the truth of this statement. But in my postpartum haze, I felt as though giving birth were such an accomplishment. And doesn't my mother like to be proud of my accomplishments? She laminated the page in the New York Times that listed me as a Guggenheim recipient, for God's sake. Unable to throw the Guggenheim placemat away in gratitude, but not knowing what else to do with it, I have since placed it below my son's high chair to catch the fluid that flows downward. Given that this fellowship essentially paid for his conception, each time I sponge tidbits of shredded wheat or broccoli florets off of it, I feel a loose sense of justice. I guess I'll keep reading from this part because I don't read it very often. So during our first forays out as a couple, I blushed a lot, felt dizzy with my luck, unable to contain the nearly exploding fact that I'd so obviously gotten everything I'd ever wanted, everything there was to get. Handsome, brilliant, quick-witted, articulate, forceful you. We spent hours on the red couch giggling. The happiness police are going to come and arrest us if we go on this way. They will arrest us for our luck. What if where I am is what I need? Deborah Hay asks. Before you, I'd always thought of this mantra as a means of making peace with a bummer or even catastrophic situation. I never imagined the mantra might apply to joy too. In the cancer journals, Audre Lorde rails against the imperative to optimism and happiness that she found in the medical discourse surrounding breast cancer. She writes, was I really fighting the spread of radiation, racism, woman slaughter, chemical invasion of our food, pollution of our environment, the abuse and psychic destruction of our young, merely to avoid dealing with my first and greatest responsibility, to be happy? Lorde wrote, let us Lord writes, and she continues, let us seek joy rather than real food and clean air and a saner future on a livable earth, as if happiness alone can protect us from the results of profit madness, end quote. Happiness is no protection, and certainly happiness is not a responsibility. As Sarah Ahmed writes, the freedom to be happy restricts human freedom if you are not free to be not happy. But one can make of either freedom a habit, and only you know which you've chosen. The wedding story of Mary and George Oppen is one of the only straight people stories I know in which the marriage is made more romantic by virtue of its being a sham. Here is their story. One night in 1926, Mary went out on a date with George, whom she knew just a little from a college poetry class. As Mary remembers it, he came for me in his roommate's Model T Ford, and we drove out to the country, sat and talked, made love, and talked until morning. We talked as we had never talked before, an outpouring. Upon returning to their dorms in the morning, Mary found herself expelled, and George was suspended. So they took off together, hitchhiking on the open road. Before meeting George, Mary had decided firmly against marriage, considering it to be a disastrous trap. But she also knew that traveling together without being married put her and George at risk with the law via the Mann Act, one of the many laws in the US history ostensibly passed to prosecute unequivocally bad things like sexual slavery, but which in actuality has been used to harass anyone whose relationships the state deems immoral. So in 1927, Mary got married. Here is her account of that day. She writes, although I had a strong conviction that my relationship with George was not an affair of the state, the threat of imprisonment on the road frightened us. So we went to be married in Dallas. A girl we met gave me her purple velvet dress. Her boyfriend gave us a pint of gin. George wore his college roommate's baggy +4s, but we did not drink the gin. We bought a 10-cent ring and went to the ugly red sandstone courthouse that still stands in Dallas. We gave my name, Mary Colby, and the name that George was using, David Verdi, because he was fleeing from his father. And so Mary Colby marries David Verdi, but she never precisely marries George Oppen. They give the state the slip, along with George's wealthy family, who by this point had hired a private eye to find them. That slip then becomes a sliver of light filtering into their house for the next 57 years. 57 years of baffling the paradigm with ardor. I have long known about madmen and kings. I have long known about feeling real. I have long been lucky enough to feel real, no matter what diminishments or depressions have come my way. I have long known what Sarah Ahmed writes, that the moment of queer pride is a refusal to be shamed by witnessing the other as being ashamed of you. So why did your ex's digs about playing house sting so bright? Sometimes one has to know something many times over. Sometimes one forgets and then remembers, and then forgets and then remembers, and then forgets again. As with knowledge, so too with presence. If the baby could speak to its mother, says Winnicott, here is what the baby might say. I find you. You survive what I do to you as I come to recognize you as not me. I use you. I forget you, but you remember me. I keep forgetting you. I lose you. I am sad. All right, so that's what I'm going to read from that book. And then it's funny reading from, seemingly disparate books because they're obviously all really related. And obviously that passage in the Argonauts about gender and color and about illusion were all preoccupations of Bluets, which I'd written, 6 or 7 years earlier. And what to say about Bluets? Nothing really to say. Whereas the Argonauts uses its, like I said, the anecdote as its kind of formal property or structure. Bluets uses numbered propositions, and that's because instead of kind of being in conversation with theory or anecdotal theory or personal political notions about theory, which the Argonauts was. The Bluets is more in conversation with, I guess, philosophical texts, in particular Wittgenstein and Nietzsche and other people who write in numbered aphorism. So that is why this took this form. So I'll just read from, it's in 240 propositions, and I'll read from 222 to the end. This is short. This will be a short reading so that we can, actually, maybe I'll start a little bit further before so that so there's a little bit more time. Okay. Let's see. No, I want time to talk to you guys, but all right, let's start. I'll read the shorter version and we'll see how we go. Okay. (222). In January 2002, camping in the dry Tortugas on an island which is essentially an abandoned fort 90 miles north of Cuba, flipping through a copy of Nature magazine, I read that the color of the universe, whatever that might mean, and here I gather it means the result of a survey of the spectrum of light emitted by 200,000 galaxies, has finally been deduced. The color of the universe, the article says, is pale turquoise. Of course, I think, looking out wistfully over the glittering gulf. I knew it all along. The heart of the world is blue. 223. A few months later, back at home, I read somewhere else that this result was an error due to a computer glitch. The real color of the universe, the new article says, is light beige. 224. Recently, I found out that les bluets can translate as cornflowers. Now, you might think I would have known this all along, as I have been calling this book Bluets, mispronounced, for years. But somehow I had only ever heard, quote, a small blue flower with a yellow center that grows abundantly in the countryside of France, end quote. So I thought I'd never seen it. 225. Shortly after finding out about the Bluets, I have a dream in which I am sent an abundance of cornflowers. In the dream, it is perfectly all right that that is their name. They don't need to be Bluets any longer. They're American, they're shaggy, they're wild, they're strong. They don't signify romance. They were sent to me by no one, in celebration of nothing. I had known them all along. 226. As I collected blues for this project in folders, in boxes, in notebooks, in memory, I imagined creating a blue tome, an encyclopedic compendium of blue observations, thoughts, and facts. But as I lay out my blue collection now, what strikes me most is its anemia, an anemia that seems to stand in direct proportion to my zeal. I thought I had collected enough blue to build a mountain, albeit one of detritus. But it seems to me now as if I have stumbled upon a pile of thin blue gels scattered on the stage long after the show has come and gone, the set striked. 227. Perhaps this is as it should be. Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the first and only book of philosophy he published in his lifetime, clocks in at 60 pages and offers a grand total of 7 propositions. As to the shortness of this book, I am awfully sorry for it, Wittgenstein wrote to his translator. But what can I do? If you were to squeeze me like a lemon, you would get nothing more out of me. 228. My injured friend is now able to write letters via voice recognition software to keep her friends abreast of changes in her condition, of which there have been many. My life can change. My life does change, she asserts. And it has, and it does, often in astonishing ways. Nonetheless, near the end of these letters, she usually includes a short paragraph that acknowledges her ongoing physical pain and her intense grief for all she has lost, a grief she describes as bottomless. She writes, if I did not write of the difficulties under which I labor, I would fear to be misrepresenting the grinding reality of quadriplegia and spinal cord injury. So here it is, the paragraph that roundly asserts, I continue to suffer, end quote. 229. I am writing all this down in blue ink, so as to remember that all words, and not just some, are written in water. 2:30. Holed up in the North Country for the month of May, a May which saw but 4 days of sunshine. The rest of the month was solid gray, drizzling, pouring rain, rendering everything green, rushing and verdant. In short, a nightmare. Every day I took long walks in my yellow poncho looking for blue, for any blue thing. I found only tarps, always tarps, pinned over stacks of firewood, a few blue recycling containers kicked over in the streets, a grayish blue mailbox here and there. I came back to my dark chamber each night, empty-eyed, empty-handed, as if I had been panning fruitlessly for gold all day in a cold river. Stop working against the world, I counseled myself. Love the one you're with. Love the color green. But I did not love the color green, nor did I want to have to love it or pretend to love it. The most I can say is that I abided it. 2:31. That month I touched myself every night in my narrow bed and came thinking of you, knowing all the while I was planting the seeds of a fresh disaster. The disaster did not come then, but it did come. Though 6 days smoothly run, the 7th will bring blue devils or a dun, wrote Byron. The most I can say is that this time I learned my lesson. I stopped hoping. 2:32. Perhaps in time I will also stop missing you. 2:33. That the future is unknowable is, for some, God's means of suturing us in or to the present moment. For others, it is the mark of a malevolence, a sure sign that our entire existence here is best understood as a sort of joke or a mistake. 2:34. For me, it's neither. It is simply the way that it is. Whether this accident be a happy or unhappy one is probably more a matter of mood than anything else. The difficulty is that our moods do not believe in each other. Emerson. One can wander about the landscape looking for clues, amassing evidence, but even the highest pile never seems to decide the case. 2:35. One thing they don't tell you about the blues when you've got them, you keep on falling because there ain't no bottom, sings Emmylou Harris, and she may be right. Perhaps it would help to be told there is no bottom, save, as they say, wherever and whenever you stop digging. You have to stand there, spade in hand, cold whiskey sweat beaded on your brow, eyes misshapen and wild, some sorry-ass grave digger grown bone-tired of the trade. You have to stand there, in the dirty rut you dug, alone in the darkness, in all its pulsing quiet, surrounded by the scandal of corpses. 2:36. Do not be overly troubled by this fact. 9 days out of 10, wrote Merleau-Ponty of Cézanne, all he saw around him was the wretchedness of his empirical life and of his unsuccessful attempts, the debris of an unknown celebration. 2:37. In any case, I am no longer counting the days. 2:38. I want you to know, if you ever read this, there was a time when I would rather have had you by my side than any one of these words. I would rather have had you by my side than all the blue in the world. 2:39. But now you are talking as if love were a consolation. Simone Weil warned otherwise. Love is not consolation, Weil wrote. It is light. 2:40. All right then, let me try to rephrase. When I was alive, I aimed to be a student not of longing, but of light. And that, and a spoiler alert, is how that book ends. And I will now stop and maybe we can talk. And I am happy to answer questions about, as the introduction said, I've written a lot of different books, and some are more lyric and some are more art critical and some are more courtroom drama. There's all kinds of things. And then there's the book that I just published last fall, which is a kind of cultural critical work about notions of freedom and liberation in the art world, and sexual liberation, climate conversation, and drugs and addiction. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm at your service.
Thank you so much. We haven't got a clapping option on the icons, but that was beautiful. And you were reading the sections that I seem to be remembering really clearly. I don't know why. That's really interesting. Okay, I'm just going to, if nobody minds, I'm going to kick off with one or a couple of questions. I was kind of smirking at the section when you were reading or quoting Riley and the whole concept of non-categorization, because that's exactly the question for you. I sort of composed here. Sort of your work is often described, you will know this, you will have read all the sort of bold, authentic, fearless, hybrid, genre crossing, genre fusion. But what I was really interested in is, it's maybe I'm behind slightly, but I've picked up on this concept. You quote from Eileen Miles, the vernacular scholarship. And I'm really interested in that. It's the first time I came across, or I've come across this concept in relation to your work. And you, quoting you sort of, when you develop the concept in an interview, from quite a while back, you say, I need to talk back or talk with theorists and philosophers in ordinary language to dramatize how much their ideas matter to me in everyday life. I can't really partake in straightforward academic writing because its language too often obscures this relation, or it relies on a logic of paranoia, which I also want to talk to ask about the logic of paranoia in theory. So this sort of defying genre classification, your work seems to blend but also devour and fuse. You will know this: autobiography, literary criticism, philosophy, theory, queer theory, feminist theory, memoir, poetic prose poetry, and so on. And I'm therefore interested in this vernacular. But my sort of sub-question here would be that what is your, and I would describe it as a transgressive relationship, or what is your disposition to yourself in the writing? And perhaps where is the threshold, if there is one at all, between binaries such as public, private, subjective, objective, empirical, and theoretical in the writing? And I will explain my second question, which was we actually just to turn the scope or the perspective of this question round. But anyway, see what you can do with this.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you said that is interesting. We can talk about the vernacular scholarship or about paranoia, but your last part, the question part about, I'm just curious to hear you, maybe you say a little bit more so I understand when you say like transgression of the self, like of one's own writing self or relationship to the self, or what. So just tell me a little more about what you're.
Yes, so I'm sort of I'm sort of asking you to work in this sort of circle, or it's not circle, within the binary of inside and outside, and looking at the hybridity of the work, fusing the subjective with the objective, the theoretical with the empirical. I wonder how that works for you, if there is a threshold, whether I even had this idea that when you write about yourself, you're right. I'm obviously splitting selves here, concepts of autobiographical self, lyric self, fictionalized self, theorized self. But when you're writing about the most subjective and the most intimate, for example, Bluets is a good example. There's a lot of heartbreak in there. Argonauts is another example. Jane is an entirely different can of worms, but there is a lot of private sort of material being used. So what's your relationship to that private sphere, or
Mhm.
that doesn't exist at all when you write?
I mean, I think that it's like, I don't presume, like, for other writers, like, I don't think it's fair to say, like, oh, we first write because we have a private self, we have things to say and represent. It may be true that a lot of people come to writing through writing, angsty poetry in their, teen years or whatever it is, but I think some people come to forms of, maybe they've done writing for many, many years. And I mean, I teach a lot of these people who've done writing in like an academic form for many years and then want to like self-liberate and write something different. And I guess all of which is to say that I've always done a lot of different kinds of writing, and it's really important to me. Okay, what I'm about to say has value talking about literature, but it also has value just talking about identity in general, which is to say that, the fidelity for me in like a piece is not to any predetermined genre. It's like it's questions that it's asking, and then the formal questions become like what voice, like how much access does this voice have to the most private things, or how much is this voice making claim on public conversation, or it kind of, how much does she swing in between, what's the relationship that's constructed via the swinging. Like there are all these questions, and each of my books kind of have had to answer those differently in terms of what and I think that that's partly why most all of them have a different publisher, because
Right.
literary publishers speak to like what audience is kind of reading in this register. And so not until I would say the past few years, after the Argonauts had kind of a surprising amount of readers, was there any kind of, I think, appetite by a lot of people to read things of mine in genres that wouldn't normally be their bag, so that's kind of been, but I think all of which is to say that on that kind of fidelity to the project over the idea of genre or audience, the part that's about identity and relates to what I read in the Argonauts about the Lacan quote about, a king being mad for thinking he's a king, just as the madman who says he's a king is also, it also has to do with a fidelity to writing as a kind of, and maybe this is your transgressive point, but a kind of undoing, and a kind of undoing of where you thought you stood before you started, an undoing of the self that speaks it. It might have political valence, like it might be involved becoming like a race traitor. It might be, like there's the quote in the Deleuze quote in the Argonauts about becoming a traitor to everything, including a traitor to writing. I think that kind of undoing, if one's interested in that process, then of course one's not going to have fidelity to also audience or genre, in that you're not going to be trying to deliver anything coherent or expected. You'll only be devoted to the kind of discovery process, and then whatever comes out. I've written lots of books where while I've written it, I just was like, yeah, just like you may have wanted to write one thing and it just came out as something else, and it just is what it is. And then you just have to live with it. And then the question though is like, was this successful on the terms that it set for itself as an aesthetic or philosophical project, and that's always the one that I have to answer first. I don't know if this is making sense.
That's brilliant. And could you just reveal a little bit more? I mean, I think I understand, but maybe just to tell us a little bit more about why the vernacular scholarship feels close to your modality or disposition as a writer.
I mean, it's funny because Eileen uses that word or that phrase, vernacular scholarship.
Yeah.
I think it relates better to what they do in their writing probably than what I do, only in that Eileen has a very, I don't know if you guys know Miles's work, but they have a very rhythmic, adamant, poetic, vernacular sound that is very kind of unmistakable. Whereas I think that, you know, for better or for worse, I got a PhD and I've written, you know, like I wrote a dissertation, and I'm not, you know, in the academic world, people think of my writing as very vernacular. But in the general public world, my writing is thought of as, you know, often as like very, you know, obtuse, and like, you know, why is she saying it like that? Why is she quoting these people? Why is she using these big words? Why is she insulting my intelligence? Blah, blah. So I think, you know, the notion of what's vernacular really depends upon the readership that you're talking about. I think, again, with like publishing, you know, you know, for better or for worse, like how you publish a book or who publishes it also kind of plays a part in what kind of book you're presenting it to be. So a book like The Argonauts, you know, may have been different if it were emanating from academic quarters rather than kind of like a more, you know, independent literary press, you know, and that book, you know, was rejected by most all mainstream regular publishers as being precisely too theoretical, too arcane, too abstract, too whatever. So the fact that, and that was, again, that was fine with me. I was like, the book came out how it came out. Like it hit the level of, like, this is a very LA thing where there's like mow and blowers that have walk around, you know, blowing leaves off people's lawns. So I'm sorry if you can hear that, but, you know, the book came out in, you know, it hit the kind of tone with talking about feminist and queer theory and other theories and psychoanalytic theory that I wanted it to hit. It hit where I wanted it to land. Now, then the publishing world kind of, you know, again, tells you like, oh, you've landed too arcane for us. You know, okay, fine. You know, Grey Wolf took it, the press in the United States that published it, you know, thought that it could, you know, be read by others and be seen as something else, you know. So then, and then that became a, you know, a fulfilling prophecy, because, you know, I'm very, actually Eileen Miles, who was a, you know, is a friend and was once a teacher of mine, you know, really taught me this about writing, that, you know, mainstream genres or publishers, you know, imagine an audience and then try and, you know, feed the audience they imagine. You know, the work that, you know, what Eileen always said was that, you know, innovators like prognosticate their audience. They bring into being the audience that they wish were there. And sometimes there's a huge temporal gap. So like in Eileen's case, they often talk about having this kind of idea of like punk dyke readership that didn't really exist like when they started writing in the 70s, but by the 90s it did, and Eileen became, you know, one of their heroes. So sometimes there's a lag time, because the lag time is precisely while you are bringing it into being, and that is important to remember, because it, you know, literature is a long game, and it doesn't even, and success is not even its goal, you know. But
Okay, thank you so much. I've got another question, but I'm gonna be unselfish and see if anybody wants to come in first before my second elongated usual.
Closing a door, sorry everybody.
We got a question from Alison Moore. Given the variety of your writing and what you have said about discovery through process rather than fidelity to audience or genre, Alison's wondering if you have a particular form in mind before starting a project, or if this happens organically as the writing develops, and how much the subject and its inspiration influences the form.
I mean, you guys are, you know, you do poetry and poetics as a center, so you know, I think poetry, which is how I came up, is especially, you know, free verse, you know, is like the laboratory for letting, you know, training yourself to have this process of like, what's the form that this poem is coming to me in, you know, and you have to choose every time how it looks on the page, or you know, is it couplets? Does it rhyme? Does it, you know, is it prose poetry? What is it? You know, and I think because I have that kind of workmanlike relationship to language, whereby I spent a lot of years like literally, you know, with rubber cement and scissors, like cutting up language and putting it back together in different forms. It's actually one of the things that, you know, obviously George Oppen is a great love of mine. And, you know, Oppen, I haven't been to his archives, but I've heard that, you know, he, as somebody who did a lot of manual work, you know, often would like actually have like nail and wood, like a hammering, like taking apart poems and like hammering them together, you know, but like actually like a really, you know, materially a construction project. And I think because I have that approach, you know, I tend to do a lot of writing without yet really knowing what the form of the project will be. And then once I've kind of figured more of that out, sometimes I have to like, I don't know how to explain it. Like I got to go back to a lot of pieces of writing that I did and like get them to fit the new tone or like the new, you know, like if it had been lineated and lines are out, well then now I have to delineate and it has to, now I've got to get all these pieces of things to work delineated. I mean, I did that with Bluets. Bluets was written lineated. And I mean, a lot of it was, and then I had to delineate it and like make it work as prose. So it's like it's a very, you know, there's a lot of words like hybrid and experiment and stuff that have like a happy connotation. They have like a happy connotation, but I don't actually think that they're, in my experience, they're not always like real pleasurable, like not knowing what you're doing. I'm just saying this for the writers out there, like not knowing what you're doing. It is a frustrating state to be, you know? So there's a kind of truce you have to hit with like not knowing what you're doing, but continuing to produce language and thought so that you're not, so that you continue to make the raw materials that you can keep making, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a sort of quick question. It's sort of back to the kind of genre question, really, as something like a hybrid genre in itself, like the lyric essay, which is sort of capacious and you can do a lot within it. I was wondering whether, in your sense of it, it's a kind of anti-genre, isn't it? So it's sort of kind of in its capaciousness. Whether in your sense of it that you're more kind of related to the theorists who can do it, so like Judith Butler or Sarah Ahmed or Denise Riley, or to the kind of pioneers in it, like Susan Sontag or Joan Didion.
I mean, if I think about like, I mean, I think, and you know, people are different like this. I certainly have a lot of friends who are writers who are very interested in like words for what they're doing. But you know, I'm like, I mean, my skittishness about like identity as like rehearsed in what I read from the Argonauts, it really extends to like the minute that I like hear the words lyric essay, and then there's like a new million classes on the lyric essay, or like right now with like, you know, something like auto theory or whatever it is, like the new thing, that then there's kind of like a, you know, and I know because I'm a teacher and like you guys, like I start seeing it in all of like my students' dissertations. Like me, I've always been, I mean, actually it's funny, my book, I have a book, I'm in my office so I can afford to do this, but like the book that I wrote for my dissertation was called, you can see it, it's called Women, the New York School and Other True Abstractions. And, you know, as per its title, Women, the New York School and Other True Abstractions, you know, the New York School is, you know, kind of another name for abstract expressionism. And this book is about women in the New York School and the, you know, from the 50s kind of through the 80s. And, but that idea of something being a true abstraction, which is a phrase from Frank O'Hara, was really important to me, thinking about literary schools and literary genre, because it's like, it's a true thing. Like, you know, we can call something a lyric essay, or we can make these categories and they have things that respond to them and that make sense to be grouped there. But when I'm as like a reader, if I'm reading Sontag or Riley or Ahmed or anyone you've mentioned, like I'm also just, I'm just, I feel like Sontag, whether it's from Notes on Camp to like other essays, I see her too as just being like, how am I going to get this said? Like, why I have these things to say about camp. Okay, I'll number it. Like, I'll make it, like I see her too looking around. I don't see her going like, I will now write, an essay called this or whatever, and so I think, at least for me, I mean, I really, I'm just, I kind of, as soon as someone starts talking about like the name of a thing, like, do you call Bluets a lyric essay or a novel or whatever, I just start to like, I don't even have anything to say. I just want to like get out of the room. Like, I'm literally like, oh no, the conversation that I can't be in because I'm too protective, I think, of like how those things might feel deadening to me, like as I go to write a new thing,
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe a simple question that relates to Adam's question, but also you mentioned auto theory, and it's probably a word that you are also you've heard it 1,000 times, but maybe let's just simplify the question, make it vernacular.
Right.
So what is the writing's connection or relation? I sort of know the answer broadly, but I'm really interested in the kind of intricacies, how sort of for you personally, how the connection between reading and writing, or writing and reading, how one shapes the other. Well, obviously how reading shapes the writing.
I mean, I'm sure like all of you, there's
because I'm only asking this because the more you publish, there seems to be a very intense sort of, and it's narrowing down in a hermeneutic method of compulsively rereading, deconstructing, rethinking.
Sorry.
It's like, shut up. Stop the conversation and go home.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, obviously, reading and writing, I mean, I remember, Bob Creeley, who was a poetry, I admired him very much. And, he would say like this is basic intertextuality 101, but even in his very pared down poems, it would say like, an apple on the road, and whatever, like that he would say like, that apple is like all the apples of, of poetry or in philosophy, like that apple holds all those apples. It's just, so even if it's vernacularly put, and I think I've always felt like some of my work has been very like, lets the apple just be named apple, and then other of the work dramatizes about who's talked about the apple and how they've talked about it and what their names are. And if I really want to dramatize it, I'll give it a bibliography and I'll name where they talked about it and all the rest of it. It really depends again on like this kind of spectrum of like how much intertextuality you want to reveal and to have be part of the project. So in a book like The Argonauts, it was really important that it be part of the project because this book like stands on the shoulders of all these feminist and queer theorists who've like enabled us to think about these things, not just to think, but to be without being like imprisoned, and having a life. And so to me, putting a lot of them in grayscale on the margins was like a manner of indicating that there was a kind of pedagogical process at play, like that somebody could like kind of skim who's in the book and have a sense of who they might want to read, or who, that kind of thing. And then also to kind of dramatize by having their words in italics in the text, like how much I'd internalize those words, Other books have different ways of, like I said, I mean, I just finished writing something this summer that, it was a great pleasure because it had no exterior quotes whatsoever. It was just kind of more like, and it was, I mean, it just goes faster because you're not like you don't have to like quote check and page check, whatever, but it goes faster. But it was just because that was the nature of that project. It wasn't like I think it's better or worse to quote or not quote or anything else,
I'm thinking also on freedom, obviously, that uses intertext in a completely different way to say, for example, the looser methods of Argonauts or Bluets. Was it difficult to write that project, by the way, the new one, with no?
Yeah, I mean, it took a really long time. It took a really long time. I mean, On Freedom is like those subjects like art, sex, drugs, and climate, like each of them, could have been their own book in terms of the amount of time I spent like researching them. And then the unit of that book, which is very loose and baggy, like they're each one is like almost like a novella, like each chapter, there are 4, and they're much longer than like an academic chapter. They're like each of them in manuscript was like about 90 pages, So, the whole time I was like, what are these? So it was very like inelegant in a certain way, compared to more lyric projects. But I felt like, it had each of those chapters had its own urgency to me as a kind of, in a more culturally engaged or like political self, So it was more of a project of how to take something so abstract like freedom, but that has always been like of interest to me as the way the concept is being wielded, and how it has been wielded, in the kind of sense, in the Wittgensteinian sense of like a language game. It was very interesting to me, and I've been taking notes for years on how I saw the word working in these different realms. And so I felt like I just felt like I had a lot to say. So it took a long time, but because each chapter could, at some points, each chapter did threaten to become its own book. Like for a period of time, I thought I should just write a book about literature and addiction and drugs, and so they were all kind of threatening to peel off from each other, and so it took a lot of time to kind of keep them all within the project.
Yeah. Thank you. Is
I saw
there any?
Loma, maybe.
I can't actually see the chat.
I don't see any chat, but
or
I
is-
saw hand up.
Or is it just that nobody has the
Yeah,
courage
sorry,
to ask?
that was my hand, but I kind of retracted it, and then you mostly answered, I think, because what I was going to ask, it was sort of how you felt about those kind of labels, like things like auto theory and lyric essay and things like that. And I was going to ask if there were any that particularly kind of perturbed you when it came to certain projects that you kind of read about and thought that feels really bizarre and kind of sits with me in a bizarre way.
I mean, I think it's a little odd when people call things like novels, only in that I feel like I work pretty much in nonfiction, but that said, I mean, I think that's just like a category error that like, I don't know. I think, but on the other hand, like probably Bluets is the closest thing to like a novel I've ever written, only in that its speaker is the most like stylized, I guess, like in her speech in a way that the other books don't. The speaking self is less stylized as a character, I guess. So, but I think that no, I mean nothing. People can say whatever they want. It doesn't. It's more like there's just this sense I have of writing as like being a fugitive, from being pinned down, and I think it's why like. After each book, I tend to have like an appetite for something really different, just to kind of keep moving. I think I'm a very kinetic person. Like I talk kind of fast and I move kind of quickly, and I'm always being told in my life to slow down. And it's writing like slows me down. Like I can be slower in writing, and working on a project for many years. Like it's a good way for me to slow down. But there's still this kind of racing, underneath. that I think has to do with, it just has to do with like, fears of boredom, calcification, over-categorization, resting on your laurels, all those things, sounding like yourself in a way that, you're telling yourself stories that are self-delusional, like just all those kinds of things. I think I get, like I'm always looking for some kind of freshness that I can induce in myself and in my life, I mean, easier said than done. I mean, I actually haven't written like a poem for a long time, in part because Bernadette Mayer, I took a poetry workshop with her some years ago. I mean, this didn't like end my life in poetry or anything, but she wrote, it was so funny to me. She wrote, these look like poems, but I'm not sure they are, on the top of like the poems I'd handed in. And I was so like horrified at the idea that maybe I don't even think she meant this, but maybe they weren't really like alive. They were just like poem imposters, that it really made me start thinking like, what's a poem that looks like a poem versus something that really is a poem? And I've been thinking about that for a long time,
Am I allowed to ask one sort of side thing as well?
I think so. I'm checking out all these black boxes of wonderful looking people's names with none of their yellow hands up, so.
Okay. I was just wondering, because I feel like there might be a lot of writers who were kind of wanting to kind of speak to that sort of space where it's kind of highly and kind of overtly intertextual, but feel kind of intimidated by the kind of magnitude of what they're drawing in. And I was just wondering what your kind of advice would be, or your perspectives might be on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, right? Because there's all this play. I mean, I like kind of behind what you're saying, I'm sensing, like, so you're invoking like some reader that might be like afraid of the magnitude of like what they're drawing in, right? Or like maybe feel intimidated, and then there are other people, like other writers, who I think kind of try and make themselves seem more important by drawing in important people, like, like, oh, this will sound really deep if I can draw in, X, Y, or Z. And then there's, a whole political dimension about citation and who's quoted, and, all the political debates about like, do we keep quoting the, dead white guys, and, what does it mean to disappear, or like, how much kind of, homage should be paid to your elders, and, I mean, there's so many different issues about citation, right? So I think my advice would just be to like, to think all those things through, to not use other people's words to substitute your own. Don't think they said it better, so I'll put it in, and then also think about like, it extends from there, that if you're going to be working with others' words, you really need to like, I mean, I don't know, I this one thing I do is I rewrite all the quotes I want to use. Like I retype whole pages of other people's books and stuff. And partly I do it because if I'm going to quote from it later, I will have like, I already have it rewritten in my computer. But I also do it because I always learn something about the way that they're thinking that when I read it, I didn't really understand. But when I retyped it, I got like in their thought and I understood it differently. And so I think like really spending a lot of time with the thing you're quoting, as opposed to just kind of glossing through in a kind of Twitter mindset, is really helpful, Marcus?
We've got a question from Marcus.
Yeah, one question was for the specifically toward the Argonauts, which I read in my seminar. And I was curious about your writing process, because what I found fascinating about the Argonauts was that it felt like one flowing string of conscious kind of. And just, I'm kind of curious how such a thing would be written and how such a thing would be edited, especially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. I had a writing teacher named Annie Dillard, who's a renowned nature and spiritual writer in the States, and this is so silly, but I'll just repeat what she said to me, where somebody asked, once how you wrote a long thing, and she said you write a lot of short things and you put them together, and it was like kind of like, duh, like how else is there, right? You have to write a lot of words and you put them together and they make more words, but like that idea that a long thing was a bunch of short things that you put together, it was just very kind of, I was like, of course it is, so I think the Argonauts has a lot of short things that are put together, and the logic of what's there is not stream of consciousness logic, like they're not written, the logic of what's there is, of all the things I wrote on the topic of this, that this book takes up, I had to, make a narrative shape, to it, like it actually is going to move through some stations, like there's going to be a pregnancy, something's going to get born, like, Harry's mother's going to die, like there are these things that are going to happen, and like where are they going to be plotted, like, because even if you hate narrative and chronology, you have to deal with it every time you start writing sentences. So there was that question, and then the other question was just, getting more and more intimate with what the book is about, such that, and a lot of that is like intuitive. Like you may have a strong intuition that certain things belong without yet knowing how they belong. And, I like things that, that border on, that border on that sense of like discursive, like, why are we here? Like in the Blue Book and Bluets, like I would read it over and over again, like when I was editing it and deciding what order things should go and what should stay and what should go. And I was constantly pretending to be a dumb reader who would say, aren't we in a book about the color blue? And when I would kind of be doing that because I would be like trying to be the dumb reader who'd be like, we've gone too long, but I like that line of like, let's go for a long time, not in blue at all. And be like, what are we doing here? And then we're going to bring this back. And that's going to be kind of like, it's more like you're constructing like in music, you're going to have like laid out some themes, you're going to let it travel really far and wide, and then you're going to trumpet the sound to remind us of why we're here, So I think just learning how to read your work really, as objectively as possible, as the dumb reader who doesn't know why the digression is there, but the more you can do that, the better an editor for your own work you'll become, I think.
I was just going to ask a cheeky one. You mentioned the 2024 essays. Can you reveal the topic?
I know it's funny.
Or you'd rather not?
From your Eventbrite, I was like, I'm trying to put them in order on my table of contents. So yeah, I'm working on that right now. Yeah, this is a book I'm having a lot of fun putting together because I'm not I don't like, there's a lot of, I'm sounding so cantankerous today, I feel like, but there's a lot of genres I don't like, but like, I don't really like writing. Like people are like, do you want to write this op-ed about, X, Y, or Z, and I'm like, no, I don't, there's a lot of occasional writing I don't like. I'm very focused on bookmaking. Like I've always been very interested in the form of the book. However, the one thing that I have taken up over the last, 20 years that I love is writing essays for artists about their work, for them to put in their catalogs or in their, zines and their galleries or whatnot. So I've, I don't know, I'm looking at this, I don't know, there's like 40 pieces or something, like over the years, from really well-known people like Prince to less known people. And but a lot of these essays they've been kind of embalmed in $100 coffee table, art books. And so I'm having a lot of fun bringing them into this new space and re-editing them and stuff like that.
Okay, brilliant. One more question, practical. When are you coming to the UK?
When am I going to come to the UK, you said?
Yes.
Okay, I'd love to come to the UK. I haven't been since before COVID, but I did go to Spain and I have been to Greece. So I have forayed out in the last, 6 months, and, it's been great. So yeah, I'd love to come again. And I don't think I've been to the UK with the Freedom book. So yeah, I don't have plans yet, but I'd love to come.
let us know.
Okay, I will. And if anyone, I know that we didn't really give you guys like a burning question chance. If anybody has anything that I see all 50 of you here, if there's anything anybody wants to ask, this is your big moment. All right, well, I'll let you have your big moment to yourself then, but Adam and Agnes, it's great to meet you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
And you too. Thank you
Lovely to
so
have
much.
you. Thanks for coming along.
All right, you guys. All right, take care.
Right. Cheerio.
Bye. Cheerio.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the Alison and Marcus for the questions.